Other than that, we'll welcome Robert Haddad.
Thank you.
All right.
One Nation.
Oh, okay.
All right, well, good evening, and thank you for coming tonight. And I'll just give my own words of thanks to Father Benton and Pierre for organising this, getting behind it. And I hope over the course of the next 4 weeks you come to thoroughly do a deep dive into the first 3 chapters of the Gospel of Luke, and that you will be enriched by this. And to know how deep Scripture really is, the connections between the Old and the New Testament, and to understand the Scriptures from a Catholic perspective. And so we can see that so much Catholic teaching and dogma really is embedded in Scripture. And that the idea that the Catholic faith or the Catholic Church and Scripture are somehow contradictory is just a myth. It's a long time myth. It's a myth that's still so prevalent in our Western societies. It's one that we need to dispel. The Second Vatican Council 60 years ago said that Catholics have to better know their faith, better know their Scriptures. And I don't think we're there yet. So we need to have these type of Bible studies from time to time to enrich our own personal faith, and to better live, better defend our faith as well. All right, so we're looking at the Gospel of Luke, first 3 chapters, totaling 160 verses all up. So we're going to basically, on average, do 40 verses a night. Want to start 7:30 on time, finish 9 o'clock on time. I'll see when we finish tonight. I'm not going to keep you back for too long. We need to do a bit of an introduction first about St Luke himself. Now, St Luke is the only gospel writer who's not Jewish. He's Gentile. And he's the only gospel writer who gives us a detailed sequel, which is the Acts of the Apostles. Traditionally, we hold the Gospel of Luke to be the 3rd gospel written chronologically. I'm of the view that the first gospel written chronologically was probably Mark, because it was the gospel, the rendering in writing of the preaching of St Peter in Rome, and therefore, because essentially the early church knew it was the gospel preaching of St Peter, then it had that reverence, that respect, and became the foundation for the Gospel of Matthew. And then we have the Gospel of Luke, 3rd chronologically. And of course, St John gives us his gospel with much more detail in other areas not found in the first 3 synoptics. Synoptics means seen with the same eyes, or looking at an event from the same angle or perspective. I don't doubt that Luke is the 3rd chronologically, though there are arguments it might even be the 2nd chronologically, but we can't determine that with any certainty. When was Luke written? Now, we need to know this because most theories out there today tell us that the Gospel of Luke is written in the 80s. If you ever hear that, you should just reject that outright. That dating in the 80s is from the German theological school or schools, which in the late 19th century onwards said Luke talks about the destruction of the temple. Therefore, because in brackets we don't believe in prophecy, we can't look at those verses in Luke's gospel as being prophetic. They must have been written post the destruction of the temple, which happened in AD 70. So that's why they place Luke's gospel in the 80s, and after that the Acts of the Apostles, etc. I look at it from this perspective, and most Orthodox traditional Catholics look at it from the perspective, firstly, the Acts of the Apostles is a history book. It's a biography of the missionary work of St Peter and St Paul. And these 2 chief characters, pillars of the church of Rome in particular, in the early church overall, if we have a biography on their lives, not to mention the climactic moments in their lives, their arrest, the Neronian persecution, the burning of Rome, their trials, their executions, their martyrdoms. That data is nowhere found in the Acts of the Apostles. Therefore, there's no way, shape or form the Acts of the Apostles was written later than AD 63, because the burning of Rome happened in AD 64. And if we can't date the Acts of the Apostles after AD 63, then we can certainly not date Luke after that date either. Luke precedes the Acts, so Luke was probably written late 50s, early 60s, and most likely in the couple of years when St Paul was arrested in Caesarea Maritima, that's on the coast of the Holy Land, before he set off on the, quote, fourth missionary journey to Rome. So that's where we find probably where best to place the writing of Luke's Gospel in the very early 60s. Luke's Gospel is written in the most superior Greek because Luke was a very learned man. And we know from St Paul in his letter to the Colossians, chapter 4, speaks of Luke as a physician, a doctor, and one of the uncircumcised. So therefore, a Gentile. And the other thing we can say of importance from our perspective with respect to Luke is that when did he become a Christian? He's a Gentile. He was originally a pagan. We know from the writings of the church historian Eusebius, that's Eusebius Pamphilus, and later St Augustine of Hippo, that St Luke was a native of Antioch. That's Antioch in Syria, north of Phoenicia, north of the Holy Land. He was a Gentile living in that city, and that's the city where Christians are first called Christian. So we have a thriving Christian community within the first decade after the resurrection. And St Peter is there in AD 42, and according to Eusebius and St Augustine, St Luke converts around AD 43. And that's important for the purposes of knowing where St Luke sourced his data on the infancy narrative in his gospel. That is, where did he get his information regarding the angel Gabriel visiting Zechariah, Elizabeth conceiving and giving birth as John the Baptist, the Annunciation of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the visitation, the respective circumcisions and nativities of John the Baptist and Jesus. Where did Luke source that information from? Certainly there would have been written testimonies floating around, maybe by the dozens, that Luke could have sourced. But because Luke is converted as early as AD 43, he is a Christian, very learned, when the Virgin Mary is still alive. And the Virgin Mary would have been with St John in Ephesus on Western Asia Minor, and most probably ended up back in the Holy Land before her death and assumption into heaven. Luke definitely would have had a direct encounter with the Blessed Virgin Mary. And if you lived at this time, and you knew that the mother of Jesus was back in Jerusalem, you would have been thinking to yourself, I'd love to meet her. You probably joined a long line of other people lining up to meet her. And Luke would have not only wanted to meet her and converse with her, but perhaps ask her those very important questions about the very beginnings of Christianity. And that he, in a sense, interviewed her and that he recorded that data. And we know that from Luke's Gospel, from the introduction, now I'm looking at the text, and this is, by the way, the reason why I'm only doing 3 chapters, I can't do the whole of Luke like I did the whole of Mark. That was an enormous task, and Luke is much bigger than Mark. It's the largest of the 4 Gospels overall by fact of word count. Now we look at verse 1, chapter 1, verse 1, and St Luke says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things which have been accomplished among us." So this is a formal introduction in classical Greco-Roman style, and Luke is telling us that many have already attempted to give us works or writings about the life of Christ. Now, many must mean more than just Mark and Matthew, because many implies more than two. We have two official gospel renderings, but we would have had other people as well writing material, and we call these traditionally testimonies. None of them would continue to exist today because they weren't considered authoritative, inspired, and therefore they wouldn't have been copied in the same way the Gospels would have been. Now, Luke goes on to say in verse 2, just as they were delivered to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. So Luke is telling us he's a second generation Christian here, because it says here, just as they were delivered to us. So Luke counts himself as one who has received the tradition from the apostles, an apostolic tradition. He is not a direct eyewitness himself of the life of Christ, particularly his passion, death and resurrection and ascension into heaven, etc. Now, verse 3, it seemed good to me also, having followed all these things closely. So if he's writing early 60s, he's been a Christian for nearly 20 years. So, and he's a very learned man, and he's been following these things closely. So he is now determined to put into one singular writing what he knows, what he's received, what he's collected over the past 20 years. But he's doing it at the request of someone. An orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. Luke is writing this for a person named Theophilus. An orderly account. That's interesting when he says orderly account. Is he implying that the other accounts are disorderly, or maybe not chronological, or maybe incomplete? We can say that safely even about the canonical Gospels. It's not to say that there's errors in them. But when we look at the canonical Gospels, there's definitely material that's not in them that would have been still existing in the oral tradition. We know that. Because in Mark and Matthew and Luke as synoptics, there's a lot of material there and they overlap. And there's certainly reliance between the Gospels, Matthew relying on Mark and Luke relying on Mark, etc., and some other sources. But the fact that John's Gospel has so much material that's not contained in the synoptics proves that the Gospels that even existed at Luke's time, if just two of them, Mark and Matthew, were not comprehensive accounts, and nor were they intended to be comprehensive accounts. They were historians in a sense, biographers, but they weren't intending to be exhaustive in their accounts on the life and times of Christ. And then, who is this Theophilus? Oh, there are different theories. Theophilus is called excellent, most excellent Theophilus, akin to excellency. So the most probable point of view here is that Theophilus is a high-ranking official in the Roman Empire who's converted to Christianity. Theophilus means lover of God, or God lover. Theophilia, lover of God, or friend of God. Now, maybe this Theophilus, his real name was Theophilus, but some speculate that in actual fact, maybe Theophilus was a pseudonym. Theophilus as a person existed, but that wasn't his real name. This was a name to maybe to cover his identity, because it was still precarious. It was very precarious to be a high-ranking Roman official and convert at this time. Some speculate that Theophilus as a person didn't exist at all, that Theophilus is just a term for the Christians in general as friends of God, lovers of God. I don't accept that because I don't think there's enough evidence to support that view. Theophilus, some speculate, was probably also, in addition to being powerful, was probably quite wealthy, and that Luke was writing this orderly account for Theophilus, not because he needed it as such, because he was already a convert and one catechized by Luke, but Theophilus had offered to sponsor the creation of a gospel that can be used for a wider audience. unconverted Jews, Samaritans, Gentiles, etc. So in verse 4, for some time past to write an orderly account, that you may know the truth concerning the things of which you have been informed, of which you, Theophilus, have been catechized, because that's the Greek word there, katecheto, informed, catechized, instructed. All right, now we go to verse 5, the birth of John the Baptist. In the days of Herod, king of Judea. Now, there are 5 Herods all up. So who's this Herod? This is the one we're most familiar with at Christmas time. Okay, this is Herod the Great, who wanted to destroy Jesus, the infant, the newborn Jesus. He belongs to a family which were very closely allied to the ruling powers in Rome at this time. Herod the Great, his father was named Antipater, and his father bailed out Julius Caesar when Julius Caesar was in Egypt with Cleopatra, and there was a local uprising, and the local army of Antipater intervened to help rescue Julius Caesar. So he earned the great favour and gratitude of Julius Caesar. Eventually, Julius Caesar was assassinated. But the Antipater family still have the patronage and friendship of the nephew of Julius Caesar, who's Octavian, who becomes emperor. So from 42 BC to 31 BC, in that decade, there's a slow drift in which the Republic of Rome is slowly transforming to become an empire ruled under an emperor. So by 31 BC, Octavian has become the first citizen of Rome. And by 27 BC, he is emperor. And in 40 BC, the Roman Senate, probably at the prompting of Octavian, makes Herod king of Judea. And he takes up that position in 37 BC, and he continues to reign in that position probably as late as 1 BC. Some would say maybe 6, maybe 4, but the more modern evidence is tending to extend his reign as late as 1 BC. And Herod the Great was not a Jew. He was an Idumean from Edom, which is next door to Judea, slightly to the southeast on the other side, south of the Dead Sea. And because he was not a Jew, he did not have the full support, of course, of particularly the zealous Pharisaical, scribal sects and others who wanted to purify Judea of all foreign interference, or all foreign domination, etc. So, so in the days of Herod, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah. And Zechariah, I'm going to give you the names of these 6 people and then put it all together in the next session. These names have meanings, and they have very important meanings. And when we put the meanings of these names together, we actually construct the gospel, what the gospel is. So Zechariah means Yahweh remembers. And he's a priest. He's a Levite. Not all Levites were priests, but all priests were Levites. So those Levites who were priests were descendants of Aaron, and those Levites who were not priests were descendants of Moses. And so those Levites who were not priests were commentators on the law, while the priests, of course, offered the sacrifices. And Zechariah is a Levite, he's a priest, and he belongs to the division of Abijah. That's what it says here. Of the division of Abijah. And Abijah means Yahweh is my father. And in the times of King David, David divided the Levitical priesthood into 24 divisions. And Abijah was the 8th division. And each division served 2 weeks a year in the temple. 2 separate weeks, 2 different times of the year. And it was, and the members of each division would divide up the various tasks by lottery. And on this day, Zechariah got the bingo prize, so to speak. He was the one who drew the lot to offer incense in the holies. And for priests who are not the high priest, this was the high point of their priesthood. It's like a Catholic priest today. Got the privilege to offer Mass in St Peter's. Not on the main altar. That's the Holy of Holies, so to speak. But one of the secondary altars, perhaps. And this is the high point for Zechariah here. And he had a wife of the daughters of Aaron. So Zechariah is an Aaronite, and so is his wife. And her name was Elizabeth. And Elizabeth also has a name. Is a name that has a meaning. So Zacchaeus, many of you are Arabic speaking. So you know, if I was to ask you the question, call out, how do you say in Arabic, I remember? Ana bazakkar. So the word there in Arabic is similar to Hebrew, Zacchaeus. Yahweh remembers, Elabet, Elohim, El-Bet. You got the two Hebrew letters, the first two Hebrew letters of their alphabet, Aleph and Bet. El-Abet means Elohim makes an oath, or God makes a promise, and Yahweh remembers that promise. And they were both righteous before God, meaning that they were both faithful in the observance of the Jewish law. It doesn't mean that they were sinless. It means that they lived very pious lives without serious sin, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the law blamelessly. But they had no child, because Elizabeth was barren, and both were advanced in years. Now, we live in a culture today that celebrates barrenhood, that loves contraception, that loves abortion, that loves sterilisation, that loves 1.1 birth rates. Because we're a decadent civilization in very dark times. In the culture of this day, to be barren was a great stigma, and even considered a curse. Fruitfulness was a blessing. Barrenness must be a curse. What sin or sins did Zechariah and Elizabeth commit so as to be rendered barren? This weighed upon them, this barrenness. They were advanced in years. So, meaning, the implication from St Luke is that they were so old the situation was hopeless. They could not have a child. When you read this at first instance, you might guess, well, how old is Elizabeth? Someone call out, how old do you think Elizabeth might be if her barrenness is hopelessly permanent? How old do you think she might be? 60? 80? This is an auction. What was that? How old? 35. Well, the 35 is closest to the mark. You'll be surprised. What's the evidence? How do we know? Not by looking at Luke, but by looking at the book of Numbers, chapter 8, verse 21 to 25. Because the law of Moses placed an age limit on the active priesthood. You couldn't be active in the Levitical priesthood until you were 25. And when you hit 50, you had to retire. That's it. You could not be active anymore in the Levitical priesthood once you hit 50. So you got 25 years left in you, Father. Don't worry, okay? You're still looking young. But that's how it was. So therefore, if Zechariah is active in the temple, he is not yet 50. So the implication is, well, normally the wife is younger than the husband. Not always, but normally. So neither is Elizabeth 50, but probably in her 40s. Mid-40s, late 40s. And in our culture today, we might think there's still some hope. Still some hope. But the average age of people in the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD was 42. So basically, you were old when you reached 50. Notice when Jesus said, Abraham rejoiced to see my day. This is in John's Gospel. And the Pharisees and the scribes listening said, but you're not even 50. How could you have seen Abraham? Meaning you're not even old yet, let alone 2,000 years of age. How could you have seen Abraham? Okay.